Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, October 25th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The White House says that Israel will keep killing innocent civilians. So White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said on Tuesday that Israel will continue to hurt innocent civilians in its onslaught on Gaza. And yes, he actually said this, and these comments were made in response to questions about the death toll in Gaza and if the U.S. thought Israel was taking a disproportionate response in its bombardment. So Kirby said, quote, "This is war, it is combat, it is bloody, ugly, and it's going to be messy, and innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. I wish I could tell you something different and wish that there wasn't going to happen, but it is going to happen, and that doesn't make it right, doesn't make it dismissible," end quote. He also reiterated that the U.S. is opposed to a ceasefire in Gaza, claiming that it would only benefit Hamas. Both Kirby and Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Tuesday that they were open to the idea of a humanitarian pause to allow more aid into Gaza, but it's not clear exactly what that means. But they're both saying no ceasefire, but maybe a pause. So, it's really something with Kirby. So he was the spokesman for the Pentagon before this, and there was one time when he was talking about Russia's war in Ukraine that he started tearing up, acting like he was going to cry, talking about civilians that were killed. And there was another instance recently in his role as the National Security Council spokesman where he was talking about the Hamas attack on southern Israel, where he started to tear up again. But here, I should have put the video in. You see how kind of dismissive he is of this idea that a reporter is asking a question like this. He's just like, look, people are going to get hurt. And Kirby is insisting that the U.S. is going to continue to urge Israel to minimize civilian casualties, but that's not happening. Israel's airstrikes are increasing, and we'll get more into that in another story. And it's clear that children are being killed in mass, and Kirby doesn't care. He just, shrugs it off. And he's framing civilian casualties as a fact of modern war, which they are, to an extent. That's why we oppose war. But Israel's bombardment has been particularly brutal, as we see that they are leveling entire neighborhoods and the types of places that they're targeting. According to Gaza's health ministry, after 18 days of bombing, at least 5,791 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including 2,360 children. So over 2,000 children. And Kirby cast doubt on the casualty numbers coming out of Gaza because the enclave is ruled by Hamas. But this casualty rate, I think, is believable if you look at the destruction that Israel is causing in Gaza. And they are boasting about how much they're bombing Gaza. They said after just the first 6 days that they dropped 6,000 bombs, so 1,000 bombs a day. And they said in recent days that they increased those airstrikes. So, at this point, it's probably tens of thousands of bombs that have been dropped on Gaza in this 18-day period. And for comparison, in 2019, the U.S. dropped 7,423 bombs on Afghanistan. That was 2019. And that was the most bombs that the U.S. dropped on Afghanistan since they started recording in 2006, and likely the most bombs that they dropped since the very early days of the Afghan war, 2001, 2002. So Israel has already dropped more than that on Gaza, which is a very small area, and it's one of the most densely populated places on the planet. So I think this death toll is very believable. If anything, more people might be dead under the rubble that they don't know about. So here you have the U.S., after over a year of what they've been saying about Russia's war in Ukraine, here basically saying, look, Israel's going to kill people, going to kill innocent children that had nothing to do with this. that's just the fact of war. We're going to keep increasing aid and supporting this no matter what. So sort of a moment of a very candid moment there from John Kirby. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu says that Monday's strikes on Gaza were the hardest yet. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told a group of Israeli soldiers on Tuesday that the strikes Israel launched on Gaza on Monday were the hardest yet. Netanyahu said, quote, "We are striking our enemies with tremendous force. Yesterday, during our attacks in Gaza, we dealt the enemy the hardest blow he suffered in a single day," end quote. So on Tuesday, the Palestinian Health Ministry said that 704 Palestinians were killed during Israeli strikes from Monday into Tuesday. And that was actually one of the things the reporters asked Kirby about before he said that, if he thought over 700 people were killed. And this is, according to the Palestinian authorities, the highest death toll in a 24-hour period since the onslaught began. So Netanyahu claimed that the strikes killed, quote, "many dozens of terrorists, possibly many more than that, and at this very moment we are finding out the exact extent of the damage," end quote. So again, I have the numbers here from the Palestinian Health Ministry. And I know in previous Gaza wars, they say the 2014 war, when over 2,000 Palestinians were killed, it's estimated that it's 60 to 70% of them were civilians. So another question here is, how many of these people are Hamas, guys that they're killing? That's not clear. And we know Hamas has very extensive tunnels under Gaza. So I would think if you're Hamas, you're kind of waiting out the airstrikes down in the tunnels and preparing for the ground invasion. So, again, this could be mostly civilians that they're killing. If 2,360 children have been killed, then it is mostly civilians, because then you include women and the elderly in there. Anyway, so Netanyahu also signaled that Israel will soon invade Gaza, although it's unclear when the operation will begin. He said, quote, "We are facing the next stage of the operation. It is on its way. You know it, and you are part of it. You are part of the spearhead," end quote. So again, he said this to a group of soldiers. So still not clear when or if this ground invasion is going to happen. It still seems like it's going to happen. You have Israeli officials saying that this war is going to take months or possibly years. So I would think that they're still planning to go in, pending, the situation with the U.S. sending more military assets to the region and all that. All right, so the next one here. Israel demands that UN chief resign for the Hamas attack comments that he made. So Israel's ambassador to the UN has lashed out at UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for saying that the Hamas attack on southern Israel did not occur in a vacuum, and he demanded his resignation. So Guterres said at a UN Security Council meeting, quote, "It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economies stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight has been vanishing," end quote. So he added that this history and context does not justify the Hamas attack and what they did in southern Israel. Guterres said, quote, "The grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people," end quote. So Israeli Ambassador Gilad Erdan called the comments shocking, and he called on Guterres to step down. Other Israeli officials criticized Guterres, including Benny Gantz, who is a minister in Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet. He's also a former defense minister. Gantz called Guterres a terrorist apologist and said that absolutely nothing can justify the slaughter of innocent civilians, which I would agree with, and I think that should also apply to what Israel is doing in Gaza. And another thing about the death toll, I know that there are, the UN agencies, UNICEF, other NGOs that operate on the ground are putting out, basically also saying, over 2,000 children have been killed. Not clear exactly if they're all getting that from the Palestinian Health Ministry as well, but they might also have, they talk to people in all the hospitals and stuff. So it's another thing to keep in mind. So the U.S., when it comes to, the situation at the UN, the U.S. has been covering for Israel at the UN Security Council, which the U.S. has historically done. And they're doing that by voting against and vetoing resolutions calling for an end to the violence in Gaza. So the U.S. and Russia are soon expected to introduce competing resolutions, and the Russian version will call for a complete humanitarian ceasefire, while the U.S. will propose a vague pause to allow aid into Gaza. And UN Security Council resolutions are really symbolic, but it is still the U.S. doesn't want to say the C word, which is ceasefire. They want to call it a pause. So some aid trucks have entered Gaza, but UN agencies have said more than 20 times the current deliveries are needed to support the population after over 2 weeks of relentless airstrikes. And another story I just wanted to mention is our picture story. UN Health Agency says that 2/3 of Gaza's health facilities have ceased functioning. So this is an article from AP, and it says a total of 46 out of 72 healthcare facilities, including 12 out of 35 hospitals, have stopped functioning across Gaza. And this is due to the lack of electricity and fuel to power the generators, and damage from airstrikes has forced the facilities to close. And that's another thing. You have these aid trucks coming in, but Israel's not letting fuel go in. So the hospitals that are out of fuel can't power their generators and have no electricity. So, you think of, you got the death toll from the airstrikes. There's definitely going to be an increase in other types of deaths. There's reports of disease spreading because sanitation is really bad, no clean water. If this thing continues for as long as it seems like it will, this is going to be, we're going to see a lot of people die. So the next one here, we just put up the live updates from Middle East Eye on Gaza. A few things here. 11 Palestinians arrested by Israel in Hebron. Israel's former prime minister says objective media is harmful to Israel. That's Yair Lapid, who's the last prime minister before Netanyahu. He says if media covers both sides, it serves Hamas. Israeli airstrike in Jenin kills 2 Palestinians, so that's over in the West Bank. More going on there. Israel strikes Syrian army assets after rocket launches. Wales mosque apologizes for Starmer visit. And this is about U.S. military personnel being injured, and that's what we're going to get into in this next story here. So this next one, U.S. forces have been attacked 13 times in the last week. So the Pentagon said on Tuesday that U.S. troops stationed in Iraq and Syria have been attacked 13 times within a week, as the U.S. is backing Israel's bombardment of Gaza. Pentagon spokesman Patrick Ryder said that between October 17th and the 24th, troops in Iraq came under attack 10 times, while troops in Syria were attacked 3 times, and a mix of drones and rockets were used in these attacks. So U.S. Central Command later said that 24 U.S. troops sustained injuries in these attacks. So 24 injuries, that's significant. Nothing really major from what I understand, but still, this is, American casualties as a result of support for what Israel is doing in Gaza. And in one incident, a civilian contractor at the Ain al-Assad Air Base in western Iraq died of cardiac arrest during a false alarm. So a group that calls itself the Islamic Resistance of Iraq has taken credit for some of the attacks, but the U.S. has not attributed blame to a specific group. The U.S. is blaming the attacks on Iranian proxy forces, referring to Shia militias that operate in Iraq and Syria. So the White House has accused Iran of actively facilitating the attacks on U.S. troops, but Ryder acknowledged on Monday that the U.S. has no evidence Iran was directing the operations. So the U.S. is expecting the attacks to escalate as Israel is ramping up airstrikes in Gaza and preparing to invade. A U.S. official told CNN that the situation in the region is like red lights flashing everywhere. So they're expecting these attacks to really increase. And the CNN report acknowledged, this is interesting. So you see the U.S. saying, oh, ultimately Iran's responsible. The CNN report acknowledged that the Shia militias in the region are not a monolith and can act on their own. One source said that how willing these groups are to act independently is always a persistent intelligence gap for the U.S., which is interesting because what they're basically saying is that they don't know if everything these groups does is at the direction of Iran or not. But they always blame Iran anyway. So regardless of the situation, the U.S. is making it clear that it will hold Iran responsible for any escalations and is warning that it will respond, signaling that there is a risk the U.S. could target Iran directly. Just from following this stuff for a while, I remember towards the end of the Trump administration, during the transition period, tensions were really high between Israel and Iran and the U.S. and Iran, and rockets were being fired at U.S. bases in Iraq. And Iranian military officials were going over to Iraq and telling these militias, stop targeting the U.S. We don't want a war right now, telling them to cut it out, which is interesting. It does go to show that Iran, it doesn't, just because these Shia militias might be attacking, again, we don't know exactly where these rockets are coming from, but it is likely one of the, the many Shia militias that operate in Iraq that were allies with the U.S. in the war against ISIS, by the way. There's this militia, state-sponsored militia group in Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces, and they were formed to fight ISIS in 2014. And their leader was actually killed by the U.S. in 2020 when the U.S. drone striked Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, the head of the Quds force that the U.S. killed. And he was also there with the Iraqi militia leader. So that's why from 2020, after that, for a few years, we did see a lot of rocket attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. And they did calm down for a while, but now they're, it could get much more serious, I think, as this Gaza war continues. All right, so the next one here, Macron says that the U.S.-led anti-ISIS coalition should fight Hamas. So French President Emmanuel Macron was in Israel on Tuesday and said the U.S.-led anti-ISIS coalition that's based in Iraq and Syria should also fight Hamas. So Macron said this alongside Netanyahu while he was in Israel. He said, quote, France is ready for the coalition which is fighting in Iraq and Syria against ISIS to also fight against Hamas, end quote. So Macron did not specify what he meant by fight Hamas, but the comments suggest that the French leader was proposing this coalition could directly intervene in the war in Gaza, which would be a major escalation. Macron's office later suggested he was talking about intelligence sharing. So he said, this is what his office said. They said, quote, the international coalition against ISIS does not limit itself to operations on the ground, but it is involved in the training of Iraqi forces, the sharing of information between partners, and the fight against terrorism funding, end quote. So the U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria are technically there under this anti-ISIS coalition. There's 2,500 in Iraq, estimated to be 900 in Syria. The U.S. also backs the Kurdish-led SDF in Syria. That's how the U.S. can control so much territory there. And, this occupation of eastern Syria, is more about controlling the resources and keeping Iran out of that part of Syria. That's what it's really about. And the economic campaign against Syria. The U.S. has brutal sanctions on Syria. So yeah, hopefully that idea does not catch on, this coalition getting involved in the Gaza fight. All right, so the next one here, Israeli think tank lays out a blueprint for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. So this article is from Mondo Weiss, and it says that there is a plan written by an Israeli think tank for the full ethnic cleansing of Gaza. So on October 17th, the Misgav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy published a position paper advocating for the relocation and final settlement of the entire Gaza population, The report advocates exploiting the current moment to accomplish a long-held Zionist goal of moving Palestinians off the lands of historic Palestine. The report's subtitle makes it clear, quote, there is at the moment a unique and rare opportunity to evacuate the whole Gaza Strip in coordination with the Egyptian government, end quote. So the Misgav Institute is headed by former Netanyahu National Security Advisor Meir Ben Shabbat, who remains influential in Israeli security circles. So this think tank has ties to Netanyahu, and essentially they are calling for kicking all the Palestinians out of Gaza, sending them over to Egypt. And this is what you hear Palestinians warning about: a second Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic, referring to the 1948 the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, of over 700,000 Palestinians who are living in now what is Israel proper. And they're fearing that that's going to happen again in Gaza. But that Egypt doesn't want that to happen, and that's part of the reason why the border has not been open. So there's a lot more details here if you want to go check it out. I just thought it was something important to point out. And Mondo Weiss is a good source on this whole Gaza war, and a lot of this stuff is going on. And they had another article recently that I thought was pretty interesting. It says a growing number of reports indicate Israeli forces were responsible for civilian and military deaths following the October 7th attack. So there are, based on interviews with survivors of the, some of the Hamas attacks, including one that was at one of the kibbutzes, at least one woman said she was a hostage of Hamas, and they were inside houses, and the Israeli army showed up and just started firing, shelling the houses that had both Hamas fighters and hostages. And they say, according to these eyewitness accounts, a lot of Israeli civilians were actually killed by the military in the crossfire. And there's no disputing the fact that Hamas also killed a lot of civilians too, but this is there is evidence that the Israeli military did as well when they were just trying to take back the areas that Hamas was controlling with hostages. All right, so the next one here, Russia is aware that the U.S. supports Ukraine intelligence agencies. So the Kremlin said on Tuesday that Russian intelligence agencies are aware of the support Ukrainian intelligence receives from the U.S. and Britain. So the comments came in response to a report published by the Washington Post on Monday that detailed how the CIA has funded and built up Ukrainian intelligence services that are now conducting attacks inside Russia, including targeted assassinations. That's the big story that I went over yesterday. And again, I don't think it got nearly enough attention. It said that the U.S. funded the SBU and the Ukrainian military intelligence to the tune of tens of millions of dollars since 2015. So the Russians, in their response to this, they mentioned Britain as well. And one thing that report did say is that the U.S., the CIA helped the SBU open a new directorate, and the MI6 also, another directorate was open to work with MI6, the British intel agency. So Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "Let's not forget what we said a long time ago. Our intel agencies have repeatedly pointed to the evidence that we have of Ukrainian intelligence being closely supervised by the intelligence services of the United States and the United Kingdom. Our intelligence agencies have long been quite well informed about this, and we have duly taken it into account," end quote. So that's Russia's response, is that, they're saying they've been aware of this stuff. And I kept that story up from yesterday, again, just because it is a big deal if people, I might keep it up for a few days. All right, so the next one, this one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And it says that officials say the Baltic pipeline destruction was intentional, and an investigation focuses on a Chinese ship's anchor. So this is a strange story, and it's about that Baltic connector pipeline that was damaged. It transfers natural gas between Finland and Estonia. You've had officials say that they suspect it was intentional, suspect it was some kind of sabotage. And the Swedish Prime Minister has said that the damage to the pipeline was purposeful. But it's strange because now they're saying it is likely caused by a ship dragging their anchor, which seems like, how is it? To me, it seems like that would be more of an accident. If you're trying to sabotage a pipeline, dragging your anchor across the bottom, especially if you leave it behind, it's going to be very clear where it came from. So this whole thing's kind of a weird story, but they're investigating, and apparently there's a Chinese container ship in the area that they're looking at that is the focus of this inquiry, that was near the area during the gas pipeline damage. Some other officials have suggested Russia might have been involved. Russia is denying it. China has responded and say that they have, denied, they deny any involvement and say that they're talking to the Finnish about this whole thing. So it's kind of just a strange story, but I think something to keep an eye on. All right, so the last one here. China sacks missing defense minister Li Shangfu. So Li has been fired, and it's not clear why. And he's the second one that I'm aware of, high-level Chinese official that was fired, and it's not really clear why. Qin Gang, who is the foreign minister, was also removed. So the interesting thing about Li is he was the relatively new Chinese defense minister that was under U.S. sanctions, and the U.S. refused to lift sanctions that were on him because China wanted them lifted as a prerequisite for a meeting between Li and Lloyd Austin, the U.S. defense secretary. So I wonder if him getting fired and somebody else being put in the position, hopefully they don't have sanctions on them, maybe that would facilitate more communication. But we will see. But both of them, Qin Gang and Li Shangfu, were recently, relatively recently put in their positions, and they were both removed as state counselors, which is a senior cabinet position in China with a higher ranking than just the regular ministers. So they serve both positions as ministers and as state counselors, but they've been removed from both. I know Qin was originally removed as foreign minister, and that was a little while back, and now he's also been removed as a state counselor. But that is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Ted Galen Carpenter. Excuse me. Biden revives Axis of Evil, a propaganda ploy. One from Daniel Larison. Biden's American bedtime story falls flat. One from Ramsey Baroud. It's not a Hamas-Israeli conflict. It's an Israeli war against every Palestinian. One from Ari Paul, Israeli attacks on journalists stifle reporting on Gaza horrors. One from Daniel L. Davis, with all eyes on Israel-Gaza, Ukraine is losing war momentum. That is everything for me for today. I feel like I'm getting sick. I got some kind of throat thing going on, so I hope I sounded okay for this episode. Hopefully it doesn't get worse tomorrow. But anyway, you could always help us out just by sharing the show, subscribing on YouTube, commenting, telling your friends about antiwar.com. All that stuff helps. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.